So Brent Vaughan is the CEO of Cognito Therapeutics. Cognito is a novel disease-modifying device platform for neurodegenerative disease, and we're super excited to have him here a day after they announced their $73 million Series B close. So congratulations on that, and excited to hear. Okay. Yeah, in this market, absolutely. And Nicole Walker, who's moderating, is a healthcare innovator, investor, and national board director for the Alzheimer's Association. So some really interesting perspective from leadership, scientific worlds, investing community on stage here. Brent, Nicole, take it away. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having us, and good morning, everyone. Thanks for everyone who's up, and hopefully everyone's caffeinated. I know I am. And thanks, Brent, for joining us this morning to be able to give your insights in this particular sector.
You bet, I'm still caffeinated.
So if any of you have had a chance to look at our backgrounds, we were talking about this earlier, it's hard to believe that we've been in and around healthcare now for 30 years, and the last 6 months in this sector has been a wild ride. Who would have thought that we would have 2 approved agents out of the agency with disease modification potential within Alzheimer's, but at the same time having an environment where we've gotten pushback from CMS around reimbursement. The flip side of that is that the VA has said, you know, we agree with the data, we agree with the FDA, and we're going to give access to our patients. But there's still so much to do. And you're here this morning as one of the leading innovators in the space from a non-pharmacological perspective. And so would love to get your insights on how you're looking at all of this macro effect in our environment right now, and some of how you look at the potential for not only innovation from the device side, but other areas. But it would be great for you to maybe walk us back to 2015, 2016, when you had an inflection in your career, you were thinking about your next steps, and you started to kind of germinate around this idea of cognition, Alzheimer's, dementia. What could be a way to innovate in the space without relying on a drug to do so? So, and this is before you had Cognito in mind. So what was that nugget that you landed on to say, this is what we need in the space right now?
Thanks so much, and thanks Henry and LSI for giving us a chance to be here. Yeah, it was kind of an interesting time, and really there were a few more things going on. I had spent about 6 years building a company in the behavioral health space, a company called Cognito, which now has the only FDA-cleared diagnostic for autism in this space. And so that would have been, you know, I tend to, as we talked about yesterday, I tend to find these products that everyone will tell you aren't going to work, and then I spend way too much time sometimes trying to prove everyone wrong, right? I think that we're at a transition there. The day that the COVID restrictions for shelter in place rolled through San Mateo County, which is where Palo Alto is, which is where our office was the day I handed the company over to the next CEO who was going to drive commercialization after having been there since employee 1 for 6 years. So literally every Monday we would do stand-up, and we had about 70 people, right? So I'd have about 50 people in person and about 15 people on Zoom who were in airports or whatever, right? That day, they put shelter in place Sunday afternoon, and we walked into the office Monday morning. I had 10 people in the office and 60 people on Zoom to introduce the CEO, and as boards like to do this, right, even though my management team knew, none of the other folks knew this was happening. And so that was odd itself. I could do a whole story about that. But I was given the opportunity to move over to the investment side with Morningside. Morningside had been our lead investor at Cognito, and I built, Cognito's now the 3rd company I built with Morningside. And when I was sitting over at Morningside and started to look at this deal flow of digital therapeutics, of devices, of drugs, I've been lucky enough to be able to work in all 3 areas. I decided there was this opportunity to take non-pharmacological approaches to do what's the next act of digital therapeutics? And we've seen with like the Pear announcement that digital therapeutics hasn't really found its space, right? But building on what was right about that, moving into what would be that next generation that could create drug-like value and drive drug-like reimbursement. And I decided that I looked around. I found optogenetics had been co-created by Carl Diestroff at Stanford and Ed Boyden, our co-founder here at Cognito. And I thought there's a chance to use things like optogenetics to use hardware and software to affect disease modification. And the only area I could think of doing disease modification was CNS. I'm just not smart enough to figure out how to do it in cardiovascular disease. Because I thought CNS, at least this is the intersection between electricity and biology. And so if ever there was a place we could use hardware and software to affect biology, we should start there. And as I was looking to start a company in the space, I came across Cognito, and at that point, it was just kind of right place, right time.
I mean, that's a super story and kind of stepping point for our discussion. So when you think back to the early days and having to, as a newly minted company, go out for that Series A, what was it like to pitch this brand new concept of using something that wasn't a drug agent to go into this particular space where there had been such a history of failures? What was that pitch like for the investors, and how did you think about building that first kind of book of proof of principle around the space?
Yeah, it was an interesting time. Yeah, so the company actually had been around for about 4 years. It had been spun out of MIT. The phase 2 data was just kind of getting ready to come out. Morningside was the majority investor. They raised a small Series A before. I think when I joined, we had 12 of us. But then we now have about 50, and things have really moved along the last few years. So it was interesting, right? We had to figure out how to position the company with investors, and I think that early stage founders and CEOs sometimes don't think enough about how you're positioning. It's not just the problem you're solving, right? So many things when you walk in, so many things about whether or not an investor is able to invest in you. Those dice are cast before you walk in the door, right? Where they are in their fund. Right? Do they have competitive investments in the space? Do they have expertise in this space, right? There's so many things that are independent of how good your product market fit might be or your technology. And I think for us, we figured out two things early on. First, I decided that there were probably no risk-averse investors left in Alzheimer's. Right? I think all of them left years and years ago, right? So I decided there's no room for incrementalism in Alzheimer's. This is a go big or go home kind of strategy. So if your idea is you want to nibble on some comorbidity in Alzheimer's, I think it's hard to fund, right? And so we decided that we're going to go, we came in, there was some discussions about different things. From day one, I said we're going to file a breakthrough designation for primary symptomology of Alzheimer's. We're going to go, not an adjunct therapy, not something else. We're going to go after memory, cognition, and brain function.
And why was breakthrough designation important for you? Because I've gotten that question as an investor from entrepreneurs of, is it worth us going through that pathway? Did it help you differentiate yourself from other competitors? Did it help with the financing story?
Yeah, I'm a big fan. I think it's a great problem. I think it's a great program that FDA has put together. I've been lucky enough to be part of 3 successful breakthroughs. 3 for 4, right, when we missed on one.
Great track record.
Yeah. So I think it does a number of things. I think people focus on it, on maybe the back end a little too much. It was so tied in to the MCIT legislation that was going to drive reimbursement and everything else. Ultimately, that might come around. That would be great. That's actually not why we think about it. I've been fortunate enough to work on both the drug side with large and small molecules as well as device. When you open an IND, right, and you're dealing with CDER, you can pick up the person who runs the case out at FDA, and you can have discussions with them, and you can have these more real-time interactions. And with CDRH, you do everything through a pre-sup, and then you wait 60 or 90 days for an answer, and then you get a written answer that didn't even answer your question, and now you're at another 90 days, right? At Cognito, we went through and we filed for our product for what ultimately became our de novo, and we told them that we were going to be a class 2, and they said, well, we're not sure you're a class 2. You should go file for, and so they answered none of our questions. Okay. You should file to a 513G to see what your designation is. We did. 9 months later, they said, oh yeah, you're right, you're a class 2. I said, great, you're 9 months behind on all my questions. And they said, resubmit, right? And so when you get a breakthrough designation, you can actually have sprint discussions. And so you can learn more in 6 months as you put together what for us our pivotal study. So you're able to have those IND-like discussions, and getting everything right before first patient in, I would argue, is more valuable than figuring out how to cut 6 or 9 months off the back end.
For sure. Maybe let's fast forward a little bit. Last summer, fall of last year, the team announced some of its early feasibility data. and at AAIC, which is the scientific forum that the association puts on. What were some of the learnings that came out of that? And I think, how did that shape how you thought about the pivotal study or the approval study in the U.S.?
Yeah, a few things. And so at AIC, and then some of even the earlier data at ADPD the year before, and a shout out for any of you who are going to be at ADPD next week in Gothenburg. We'll see you there. A few things. So we found signal in the areas that everyone is looking, right? And so our key endpoints that out of our phase 2 that aligned best with our mechanism of action were the MMSE, the mini mental status exam, the ADCS ADL, which is activities of daily living, right? And we were lucky enough to through the sprint process to get the FDA to agree that those would be primary endpoints. And to your earlier question about investors, I had every investor for 6 months tell me that the FDA is not going to make those primary endpoints. They've never done it before. And we actually paused our fundraising. We went out, used the breakthrough process through Sprint, got that across the finish line, and came back to those investors and said, here it is. Look, and they're like, oh, yeah, we probably thought they were going to do that.
How did that affect your learning or thinking around the patient population for other innovators who might be in the audience who are working in the space? In terms of the target patient or what the disease profile needed to look like, a lot of times we paint Alzheimer's and dementia as this kind of monolithic profile of a patient, and it's not a homogeneous disease at all. So how do you, to an investor, or if I was explaining this to my 80-year-old mother, how do you articulate what that disease profile looks like and where you're more likely to have success, you think?
Yeah, I think this is one of those things where you kind of have to stay true to your base belief system, right? Like we talked about yesterday, the brain is the only major system in the body that we don't have a functional model for, right? We can make artificial hearts and artificial kidneys, and we can't make an artificial brain. We truly don't have a unified theory for how the brain and cognition works. We look at empirical evidence, and then we draft a hypothesis around it, which is how we got so locked into the amyloid plaque hypothesis, right? And then when the data changes, everybody's views change. And so I think for us, we were always convinced early on, and from my earlier work in drug development and Alzheimer's years ago, that we're never going to really solve progression in this disease state until we start to deconvolute the heterogeneity in these patient populations. And so I think that although amyloid clearly correlates with disease progression, and removing amyloid has slowed depression, as Eisai has shown so well for the world, it didn't bring that progression to zero, right? And I think for us, we think about the heterogeneity here, and we try to be careful to not become too much of a follower, because everyone else is setting up the race that they want to run, right? And it is really hard to be a follower, run their race, and play by exactly their rules, right? And still be a winner. And so one of the things that we noticed in our data, we do MRIs for safety. We analyzed all of our before and after MRIs, and we showed that we were slowing disease progression by preserving brain volume. Right? One of the hallmarks of Alzheimer's is accelerated atrophy. In fact, in the old days, you could look at MRIs before you could do PETs, and you could use that to help diagnose Alzheimer's. Nobody talks about this because nobody's been able to fix it, right? The antibodies that are targeting amyloid actually accelerate brain atrophy. And so the patients on active are losing brain even faster than the untreated patients. We found that we were preserving brain volume, and we think this ties into our mechanism. And so finding an area that no one else was talking about, and then having the confidence to make that front and center, we think is important.
And so maybe extending that question a little bit further, let's play devil's advocate a little bit. For, in my prior life within Abbott Biotech Ventures, there was a bias that in order to get to a true target, to affect biology, that pharma would have a better shot on goal than anything else. How do you kind of push back or offer a counter thought to that bias within both the clinical community perhaps as well as the scientific community?
Yeah, I think, and I started at Lilly, right? Yeah, so I started on the drug side. I would argue if you build an investment group and you hire a whole bunch of advisors that all come out of the pharma business, and you ask them how to solve a problem, it should not be a surprise that they decide pharma is how you're going to solve the problem, right? I think there's a little information bias there. I think that the key for us is, the underlying approach is based upon our co-founder, Dr. Boyden and Dr. Tsai, right? And Dr. Tsai does basic research in Alzheimer's, so she's looking at novel targets and etiologies in Alzheimer's. And Dr. Boyden actually comes at it from engineering, and Ed co-invented optogenetics and this idea of using electrical impulses, electrical activity across the brain to start to change biology. And so I think when we go out and we talk to investors, my thought here, right? And there's many ways to skin this cat.
This is why we brought you here this morning.
Yeah. You got to be careful about what are the battles you want to fight, right? I think that we talked about digital therapeutics just a little bit, and my advice was always, if you have a novel product in a novel space, you better have a tried and true business model for how you get paid. And if you want to invent a whole new business model, then you better have a pretty tried and true product, right? Novel product, novel business model, you got to start with a lot of money, right? And so I think for us, we kind of looked through how we were going to pitch this, and we thought, listen, we're kind of a tech bio play, right? We are an intersection of technology and biology. Everybody out here who's raising money that thinks they're the intersection, but that thinks they're kind of this joint. Remember our Venn diagrams from way back when we were in school, right? Everyone thinks your investors are the union of the graphs. I'll bet you they're the intersection. So you think you've got this huge sea of investors, but you actually have a sliver who probably, and then the broader group might come along, right? But those are the people who are going to give you a term sheet and going to lead. And so we actually had a bit of a conundrum, right? The investors that understand Alzheimer's are drug people, right? And they don't understand device. And they're like, this probably will work, but we have no idea how this gets paid for, right? And the device people look at it and they say, we don't understand Alzheimer's, right? I actually had one medtech analyst just like, well, you know what? I'm not going to get a consult from the bio guys. I'll just figure out Alzheimer's. How hard can it be? He didn't come back. Turns out it's kind of hard, right? And so I think for us, we looked at it and we said, listen, we've got a novel mechanism, we've got a novel target space. How do we make our story look like just another biotech story? And as we talked about, every biotech deck in the first 10 slides, right? There's a management slide, there's a pretty slide with a picture on it, right? There's a slide that says, here is the unmet need. It is a lot easier to raise money to solve a big problem than a small problem, right? And so Alzheimer's is a pretty big problem. And then somewhere in there is a slide, and it's always the same. We have a novel technology that allows us to have an advantage in targeting this space that no one else can target, a heretofore untargeted space. And so we realized that there's this really crowded target space of protein pathology. And there are drugs that have been developed to inhibit protein production for tau, amyloid, alpha-synuclein, right? To change how proteins fold, right? Or to start to remove those proteins with antibodies. And that in turn affects this space of electrical dysregulation across the brain. And we realized that we could tell our story that way. There is a novel target space, which is electrical dysregulation across the brain. We are going to modulate those targets with electrical activity that we drive. And so we have discovered a novel target space that is uncrowded, that no one's been able to target before, and we have a proprietary platform to drug those targets. So we tried to make it look like things that investors were used to consuming.
Okay. Thinking about it from going back to the comment around the agency and CMS and their reluctancy to reimburse, at least for the drug opportunities that have come forward so far, and even back to the comments you made around peer and digital therapeutics and the challenges that we've had there. Did any of those headwinds shape how the team thought about the design of the study, what you would need to have, not only from a regulatory approval process, but also on the back end of it from a market access adoption perspective?
Yeah, I think that since there's a lot of medtech at this conference, right? I think that there's some real differences between coming from a device. I mean, we decided to be really clear about how we're going to order and paid for. We are a DME. There are codes that are established for DMEs. We know how to get paid for it, right? Keep in mind on the drug side, once you get approval, everyone assumes it's going to get covered, paid for, right? And so that's kind of your finish line. And you can sell a company on approvable data, right? On the medtech side, once you get approval, you have a whole second. It's like you run the marathon, and then they come back and say, guess what? You got 15 more laps on the track, right? Because now you got to show you that they can get covered. There are lots of devices that are FDA cleared that never gain coverage. And so I think for us, a couple things we did. I brought in a very senior level commercial person that understood better than me, right, how these things get. I hired him over a year ago. I brought him in early on because I understood investors were going to say, we're not sure this is going to work. And then they'd say, okay, it probably works, but how do you get it paid for? And so we tried to get ahead of that, right? Try to anticipate where the obvious questions are going to come from. And then also try not to get whipsawed a little bit. I mean, bankers are great because they can tell you where the market's going, but they drive down the freeway looking through the rearview mirror, right? When Aduhelm got its conditional approval, I actually had multiple bankers and investors say, is there any point in investing in Alzheimer's research? Biogen has solved it, right? And like 3 months later, when they pulled the product from the market, they came back, right? And so you've got to be, you got to listen, but you can't let them yank your leash around.
I think that's a great point. And so making that commercial hire so early in your process, is that something that you would recommend to your fellow innovators, or is this specific, you think, to like being in the Alzheimer's and dementia category? How do you look at it?
No, I think that more and more people are doing it, right? I think that even on the drug side, this idea that when you get approved, it just gets covered and paid for, Biogen would argue against that, right? Look at what they've done at Eisai with Leqembi, and obviously Biogen is the partner there, right? There were tons of lessons learned from Aduhelm that are being applied to Leqembi. And where I started my career, I guarantee you there's people out in Indianapolis are watching this closely and seeing how it rolls out. And so I think the idea of just get it approved, and if you're solving an unmet medical need, everything takes care of itself, I think those days are kind of past, right? And so I would advise everybody to be thinking down the road about this, because when I was on the drug side, we always talked about you just work back from the label claim, right? What's your label claim, and let's work back from that. And I think now you have to think about, how is this going to get paid for? How is that label claim going to fly through CMS? If Alzheimer's, right, we're about 90% Medicare population, right? So you can't ignore CMS here. And so I think doing that early on, because ultimately, I think if everyone has followed, I think that, there's a couple, Keytruda is a famous example, right? There's a couple key interesting drugs out there where you have multiple companies with almost identical drugs, and yet you see a 5 or 10x difference in revenue. And this is because they figured out how to position and how to drive coverage for those molecules, and device is going to be the same.
Let's talk a little bit about the concept of access for these patients. That's something that we spend a lot of time working through at the board level. Since this is such a heterogeneous condition, as you've thought through the process of recruiting and enrolling patients into the HOPE study, how did you think about access? Because one of the stats that came out in the facts and figures update for this year from the Alzheimer's Association was that it's still a disease that's disproportionately so for women and people of color. So was there a conscious effort to try and mirror that in the enrollment, and what are some of the things that the team is trying to do to make sure that there is more of a diversified picture in what you're looking at?
Yeah, this is increasingly becoming a big deal. And for those of you that are thinking about registrational trials going forward, do a little homework on this, right? A little shout out in the Alzheimer's space to a group called GAP, which is the Global Alzheimer's Platform. John Dwyer runs this. One of the things that they bring to the table is you can actually hire them alongside your CRO, and they will help drive to make sure that you meet your enrollment diversity requirements as part of your filing. And the FDA is paying more and more attention to this, right? And so I think that it's just one more complexity on top of what we do already, which is pretty hard, right? And so I think that's key, and I think that this is another place where you don't want to go color too far outside of the lines of what everyone else is doing in Alzheimer's, but you need to be a little creative, right? The Alzheimer's Association reports over about 6.5 million people in the U.S. with Alzheimer's, about 55 million worldwide, and yet every CRO will tell you there's not enough Alzheimer's patients for our studies, right? Well, they're clearly out there, right? You have to figure out how you can find them. And so we've built our own in-house engine to use Facebook AdWords and be able to target that way. We layer that alongside working with the Gap Group, and layer that alongside the organic efforts that we drive through local KOLs and the CRO. And so I think that, you know, we're kind of doing a full court press against this, but I do think that you need to think about there are lots of patients out there. How come we're not getting to them? And the reason we're not getting to them is we're just not getting in front of the right people at the right time.
Is it access to the physician, or is it more patient reluctance around having the discussion even with the clinician, do you believe?
You know, I don't think that's the case, and I know we have a few neurologists in the room that actually see patients, right? And so I think that that there is a little bit of a catch-22 where physicians tend to be reluctant to talk about degenerative diagnosis with patients if they don't have a modality of treatment, right? And you've used to see this in oncology a lot, where they were reticent to talk about the real hard outcomes because they couldn't do anything for the patient. And I've had multiple neurologists tell me that and physicians tell me that they prescribe memantine and Aricept, and after the first or 6-8 months, when the benefit is mostly receded, they're really writing that script for the family. And so I think that that's part of it, but I really think it's more about just trying to break through the noise level, because I have a family member on my wife's side that is struggling with advancing Alzheimer's right now. I lost my grandmother to Alzheimer's. I think that one of the differences here between cardiovascular diabetes, some of the other places we worked, here's a patient population that is looking at an inexorable decline of their peers and are highly motivated. Right? Our device, our dose is that patients wear it an hour a day at home. In our phase 2 study for patients that completed, we had over 90% compliance to daily adherence. And it's because they want to do something, right? They actually, if you think about diabetes, right? People would love to have their diabetes well managed without them having to do anything. Sure. This patient population wants to feel like they're doing something. And I think that that's something that we can leverage.
We both bring a personal take to the challenge that we have in front of us. I stand here sit here as a director within the Alzheimer's Association, but also as a daughter and advocate for someone who's in the later stages of Alzheimer's, and think a lot about what more we could be doing, not only from the non-pharmacological perspective, more medtech. Do you think that there's a potential for additional innovation within the space of additional tools or services that would help outside of just having a therapeutic, which is hugely important, but to either increase the ability for patients to communicate or to make these technologies more adoptable by the clinicians at the end of the day? Because the reality also from the clinician's perspective is that it takes a specialist a lot of time to intervene and make the diagnosis here. And there aren't many specialists, and it's not evenly weighted in all states. And one of the things we talk about at the association is that some of our states have a neurological desert. There might be only one neurologist for every 10,000 patients in a given state, right? So how do you think technology can help bridge some of those gaps that we have here as well?
Yeah, so I think the diagnosis and the tools being used to affect a much quicker, much less invasive diagnosis. This is moving along pretty quickly. We're going to see dramatic changes over the next couple years. When we were doing our negotiations with the FDA around our pivotal study, we eliminated PET as a requirement. So for us to enroll Alzheimer's patients, we are actually using a simple blood test. We're using a p-tau 181. Lilly just announced yesterday that they're now partnering up with Roche to commercialize another version of this. And so there are lots of things happening in digital therapeutics, right? We're working with a company called Linus out in the Boston area that uses tablet-based interventions to create a cognitive trajectory of patients to be able to identify them. I think the blood tests, like what the folks at C2N are doing, combining, right? Things like p-tau 181. So I think that's moving quickly. And that's just not in our wheelhouse to try to solve that, right? I think the big one, we see with Leqembi a 27% slowing. We were fortunate enough to see about a 75% slowing of progression in our study. We hope to repeat that, right? I think that the other area that is huge that people, I'm sure, are focusing on, at-home care partner burden, right? One of the things that we learned when we reach out to at-home care partners, which is usually a family member, right, is that they actually like the slightly longer screening and onboarding appointments. They like the fact that our treatment is an hour a day, because everyone's always self-conscious about the thing they think we should do better, right? We would love to deliver this in 30 minutes, not 60 minutes, right? The at-home care partners say, you know what? It gives me an hour off, right? They really like that. And so if we could make it shorter, would we? Of course, right? But I think that you need to think about what's the environment you're placing this product into. And right now you don't have to worry about adherence compliance quite so much with the antibodies, because they're going into infusion suites, right? They're like oncology patients. But I think when you start to think at aging at home, supporting healthy aging at home, then finding a way to better engage that care partner, it's a part of the equation. And there's so much data, which we don't have time to go into, about how this impacts the care partners and the families. I think that's a huge unmet need.
Yeah. Well, one of the stats that came out was, in addition to the 6 million people who are affected by the condition, there are 11 million caregivers associated with the problem as well, and the estimate is the cost associated with Alzheimer's treatment and management is just shy of $350 million. So, $350 billion, and we think it might go as large as $1 trillion by 2050. So this is something that we really do have to wrap our arms around. I just want to do a quick time check before we go to. Sorry, I can't see him. I'm short. Thank you. So maybe in the last 5 minutes or so, we can talk about, some of the things you wish you knew when you started this adventure, and I do call it an adventure of trying to create innovation in this space, and the feedback you would give others who are kind of in that similar stage of development right now, and maybe for the investors who have shied away from this space historically, especially on the medtech side, what you would tell them about why there's an opportunity here now based on where we are.
Well, I mean, I wish I would have known then what I know now, because I think that when you're leading a company, whether it's with your board or with your investors, I try to tell my team, part of what the board pays me for is to be able to predict the future and then make it happen. Right? You want someone who walks in and says, here's what's going to happen by year end, and at year end you show that you delivered that thing that happened, right? And you do that a couple times, and people start to trust that you can predict the next future.
But development doesn't always happen on a purely perfect Gantt chart.
It almost never happens on a purely. When I was at Chiron, we had Gantt charts that went all the way down the hallway, right? They're 17 years long. And it's like, why did you really need to print those last 10 years? Right? They drive the financial model, but that never happens that way. So I think, trying to do that a little bit, which means if you back out from that, try to predict entire success to things that you can figure out how to deliver on your own, right? That you can drive a little bit more. I think that, the thing that I would say to investors and people that have either been in the space in the past or are thinking of coming back or moving into it for the first time, is I think that we're at a really exciting time, right? The story talked about lunch a little bit. I think, I'm sure everyone will know. Well, actually, everyone won't know. They're not. Some of the people aren't old enough here, including me. But prior to 1954, it was established fact that no one could run the mile in less than 4 minutes. And there were scientists that actually wrote large papers saying why the human body can't maintain this 15-mile-an-hour pace for 4 minutes. And if you did it, it would have to be this optimized athlete in perfect conditions. And then in 1954, this mid-distance runner, who was actually not the greatest runner except for that day, named Roger Bannister, broke the 4-minute mile on a day that wasn't perfect. And everybody wondered if this was just like an anomaly. In less than 2 months, someone else broke the 4-minute mile. Before the following year was out, there was a race where all three of the top three people crossed the finish line in less than 4 minutes. And we've had almost 2,000 people in competition that have run a 4-minute mile since then. So it turns out that this actually wasn't a barrier, right? This was just a goal. And once people understood it was a goal and not a barrier, people started breaking it, right? And I think that that's where we are in Alzheimer's, right? We saw the first disease modification, even though there were a lot of issues around Aduhelm, it showed that there was a way to do this. Leqembi has now followed up. Lilly, I think, will gain approval going forward. And so I think that we're going to see more progress in Alzheimer's. in the next 36 months than we've seen in the last 20 years. And going back to this idea of predicting the future, right? When I sit down with bankers or investors, I say, listen, we all love asymmetry of information. Financial markets thrive on it, right? I am sure that we are sitting in quarter 3 of what is going to be about 8 consecutive quarters of generally positive news, right? When Biogen announced their conditional approval, accelerated approval, the top 10 public companies in the Alzheimer's space gained $70 billion in market cap within 14 days. And a lot of that receded when there was the bad news. When Eisai came out with their top-line data in September, same companies added $50 billion in market cap within about 2 weeks. And so this is truly a rising tide that is lifting all boats. And I think it is the most hopeful time for investors in Alzheimer's, but also patients and families.
Do you think that there is any particular or specific way that a medtech or device solution is positioned in the background of all of that?
I do. I think that I used to joke when, especially when I was on the drug side, that devices is the unloved stepchild of drug and pharma a little bit, right? We actually have an advantage. If you look at all of the issues that have happened with drug approvals, right? These are all very, very CBER focused, right? The Aduhelm debacle and the issues were over at CBER. Leqembi has been able to navigate that. CDRH has actually been, we found, quite progressive and good to work with here. We think we're excited about the way Jeff Shuren is leading and building the team there. I have investors say, well, geez, up until a few weeks ago, what is Billy Dunn going to think about this? I'm like, we're pretty sure that Jeff Shuren over at CDRH is not going to, doesn't matter, right? And so I think that this is actually, CDRH is showing that they're willing to provide clarity and path forward that is a little bit more rational and they've been a little responsive. And I think CBER and CDER, I think it's a little more difficult path. So we have a little bit more clear field running in front of us, and I think that's good.
Excellent. Well, at least from my perspective, and I'm sure for many in the audience, fingers crossed, right? Because if you look at the clinical need, the size of the market, the financial impact that we have on our economy and our families, this is one of the top areas, right, within our industry where it is ripe for innovation and better solutions to date. So I want to thank you for your time this morning and your insights in the area and for all the success that the Cognito team has had to this point, and to thank LSI and everyone this morning for taking the time out to listen, and hopefully you'll have a great rest of your day.